Hey everyone, Richard from Digital Foundry here, and this is Rise of the Tomb Raider running at native 4K resolution on Titan X Pascal. The card itself has been overclocked just a touch, 100 MHz to the core, and the G5X RAM, we've added 700 MHz to that. Gives us about 11.4 gigabits per second effective there on the modules. Now that's quite interesting because for 4K resolution we really do recommend having as much memory bandwidth as possible. So yeah, here we're actually dipping into the Tomb Raider settings here. Mostly high, very high. We've dropped a couple of things down to normal or on as it's referred to here. And here you can see the resolution. Native 4K, SMAA, triple buffered VSync. Idea here is that we want as close as we can to a locked 60 FPS, and that's not really happening here as you can see in this cutscene. But generally speaking, in terms of actual gameplay, we are pretty much there or thereabouts. Now one thing that is interesting is that we are actually capturing the gameplay here on a secondary PC, so this is exactly what's coming out of the machine. You don't really tend to get that with shadow play captures. It's not really accurate in terms of what you actually see on the display. One thing you will note is that in gameplay, frame rate does kind of vary between 50 to 60 FPS. Now I was actually playing this on a Samsung 4K UHD TV 40 inch, which I'm currently using as a desktop monitor replacement. More on that soon, but it's a pretty epic experience. One thing I did try actually was to set up a 50 Hz 4K resolution, and what happened there is that gameplay is pretty much locked to 50 Hz, 50 FPS. And this is really interesting because you get a perfectly consistent gameplay experience, perfectly level frame times, and it is pretty superb. So yeah, first experiment there sort of suggests that Rise of the Tomb Raider, you can't lock to 60 FPS, and I did actually try further settings tweaks with only limited success. So I decided to keep the eye candy there and just put up with the frame rate dips there. Or as I said, just lock to 50 Hz on a 4K display, you get a perfectly consistent experience. Okay, so now we're moving on to The Witcher 3. Quick look at the settings here, and we're pretty much on Ultra for everything here. And one thing we have done is to turn off Hairworks, of course, which just completely drains system resources for a very limited visual return. And yeah, 60 frames per second pretty much from start to finish. There's one dip that I noted here when the Griffin comes along and lands. There's a huge plume of alpha effects, and that does cause some issues. But otherwise gameplay is pretty much locked to 60 frames per second, and this is a really good experience. Now I did try this test with GTX 1080 on high settings, and I was still getting frame rate drops there, and I think the reason why there is that we just didn't have enough memory bandwidth on the 1080 even when I overclocked the G5X modules. Now here we have 30% more bandwidth, and it is just a beautiful experience here. And yeah, it is a pretty much locked experience. There are just a few drops on alpha heavy scenes. Now you can actually mitigate that in the settings by adjusting the grass detail, which seems to free up enough memory bandwidth to sort everything out. But yeah, absolutely brilliant stuff. And we're about to move into the second test that I did for The Witcher 3 here, which is a run through Novigrad City. Now you'll recognize this from our benchmarks. And on the 1080, this just wouldn't lock at 60 frames per second at all, even on high settings. Even when I moved a few settings down to medium, it just wasn't having it. But here, no problem at all on ultra settings all the way, so that's a really impressive turnout there. Overall, I reckon that you could have an excellent experience with The Witcher 3 at 4K maxed, and with something pretty much locked to 60 frames per second. Beautiful game, and even more impressive at 4K. Okay, so we're moving on now to Star Wars Battlefront. Not expecting to see any issues here. On GTX 1060, I used ultra settings, had some frame rate dips down to the mid 50s during the Endor stress test. So we're going to rerun that test here and see how we get on with the Titan X Pascal. Yep, and as expected, it is a completely locked 60 frames per second. This is with everything on Ultra. The whole experience, nothing pared back whatsoever. Completely silky smooth experience here, and yeah, it's quite a treat visually, I have to say. So yeah, good stuff there. But what's interesting is when we move on to the next title, we're going to be sticking with DICE as the developer. We're going to be sticking with Frostbite 3, the same engine, and we're going to be taking a look at Mirror's Edge. Okay, yes, so Mirror's Edge. Let's dip into the settings and see what we've got here. Native 4K resolution, resolution scale 100%, GPU memory restriction off. Now the settings we're customized here. We're mostly on high, but we do have hyper quality textures simply because we've got a surfeit of RAM available there. But one thing I did have to do to get that 60 FPS lock that was a bit troublesome for me was to drop down from HBAO plus to just standard SSAO. And for a stark game like this, you'd be surprised at how just one setting can adjust the aesthetic quite so much. So it was a bit of a disappointment that I had to turn that off to get the locked 60. So yeah, a bit of a disappointment on one hand, but obviously Star Wars Battlefront, we could lock that game at 60 FPS with no problems whatsoever. But Mirror's Edge, we are some way off the ultra settings here. That just wasn't possible. And as for hyper, that was completely off the table at 4K, although textures is simply a matter of VRAM and we've got tons of that available, so we could at least use that option. And here's that final money shot. Again, take a look at the corner there, 60 FPS locked. Good stuff. Okay then, so Grand Theft Auto 5, let's dip into the settings here. Again, 4K native confirmed, VSync on. And pretty much every setting in the standard settings menu there moved up to max, although we did drop down the grass one level. Now on the GTX 1080 we could actually run on similar settings with no problems whatsoever in the city areas, and you got exactly the same sort of experience as this. And you can see in the corner there GPU utilization is about 75-78%, so the Titan X isn't really being stressed here at all. Excellent gameplay experience, no real compromises to the visuals, looks fantastic. But on the 1080 the grass was a real issue. What would happen was if you moved into a grassy area, you'd suddenly drop frames really quite noticeably, and there's a lot of stutter, a lot of slowdown, really not impressive. So this is actually what you might call a grass stress test, where I've moved into a grassy area. So I'm just going to sort of wander about in the hills and try and see if I can impact that frame rate at all. Now I could when the grass setting was at ultra, but one notch down, no problem whatsoever. Completely silky smooth, great stuff. So yeah, I'd say that Grand Theft Auto 5, a completely locked 4K 60 experience with excellent quality settings, is no problem at all. Now let's move on to Deus Ex Mankind Divided, which has generated a lot of controversy for its kind of lackluster PC performance. Now you do need something like a GTX 970, GTX 980, 1060, that kind of thing to get 1080p at high settings. Now at 4K, completely different ballpark. Now this is an engine-driven cutscene set in the Prague railway station. So we've played a fair amount of the titles so far, and it's by far the most demanding area in the game. And yeah, the performance isn't exactly fantastic here. 48 frames per second, 51 frames per second, not great. And it's one of these interesting titles where you can really push the settings downwards, but you don't really tend to see that much of an increase in visual return in terms of frame rate. So, you know, there's not really much point dropping the settings that much. Shadows is usually an easy win, not so here. Depth of field, yeah, you can claim back some frame rate there. But yeah, you can see here, again, 48 frames per second. These is kind of like on the high level settings here. A few things can be ramped up slightly higher with no impact on frame rate, but really dropping stuff down and getting to 60, it's not really doable. And again, I did try Deus Ex on my 4K UHD TV with a 50Hz refresh. FreeSync caps you to 50 FPS there. There were still dips below, but we were pretty much locked to 50, and it was a far more consistent experience. Okay, so Crysis 3, now you might recall ultra settings, or rather very high settings on the GTX 1080 here, it did cause some issues. Now what we're doing here is using a selection of very high and medium settings. So let's take a look at what we've done in terms of our presets there. So yeah, particles on high, alpha really is very taxing. Shading, drop that down to high, shadows to medium. Everything else is pretty much on the max though. And yeah, let's dip into the gameplay, see how we get on there. Okay, so we're looking pretty good so far, 60 FPS locked. We don't really have that much of an impact on the overall visual quality compared to the full fat experience. Now here's that alpha test where the explosion goes off. Dip down to 53 FPS momentarily, but yeah, pretty good all around really. That's really a big stress point. You can run that at 1080 on a GTX 980 and that will still drop frames, so the fact that we're actually doing pretty well there at 4K with the Titan X, pretty good stuff. Okay, so yeah, this cutscene's pretty interesting. It gives us a lot of geometry to process, a lot of grass, really is demanding on system resources. But again, you can see that we're doing pretty well there in terms of GPU utilization. The turbo wasn't even on max for a little bit there, and now we're back up. Basically, GPU utilization sort of varies between 77 to 80%. Now, usually when you're stress testing a GPU, that will be at 100 all the time, but the issue there is that your frame rate is highly variable. And that generally doesn't translate into a decent gameplay experience. The human eye sort of relies on consistency really, which is why if developers can't hit 60 FPS, they go for 30 FPS, because that is the next most consistent frame rate that's achievable on, certainly on console hardware. We really want to be locked on 60, and we're pretty much there on Crysis III, which is really, really impressive. Still a really demanding game even now. The game was never designed for 4K resolution. I was actually speaking to id Software when I first started testing 4K, and they were saying that their shaders just aren't optimized for this sort of resolution. So the fact that we can at last run this game at 4K, pretty much at a locked 60 FPS, it really is an impressive achievement. So the takeaway here, is Titan X a 4K 60 graphics card? I'd say yes, but obviously you've got to be careful with settings management, but you know, that's the case on any kind of GPU really. You can have a GTX 1060 which should blitz 1080p, but you've still got to be realistic with settings in many scenarios, and it's the same thing with Titan X Pascal at 4K. And yeah, I'd say you can get a superb experience here. I've been testing this out for several days now on a 4K screen. I've had a superb experience with it, and yeah, it really is a game changer in terms of visual quality. So yeah, this is the future of graphics technology, and it's really impressive. Okay, so I'll leave it right there for now. Please do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll catch you next time.